When we are able to do that, when we were able to make things that are truly accessible and inclusive, which those are two different things, but when we can do that, we actually make it better for everyone.
Welcome to the Kindness Is podcast, where we take a deep dive into the true meaning of kindness. I'm your host, Caitlin Johnstone, the co-founder of Kind Cotton. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Kindness Is pod. I am super excited because every once in a while, in our special corner of the internet, you meet some really amazing people who you consider friends, and Kasey is one of them. Kasey is a published author, speaker, and advocate in the disability community. She is a mom of 2 boys, both who receive special education services. Kasey has been sharing her story of being the first patient ever to undergo fetal surgery for spina bifida in the state of Michigan. She also speaks to make change for future patients who receive the same diagnosis as her and her son, Carter. Kasey and her son, Carter, who is now 9, are working together at writing their first children's book to teach kids what it is like to experience having to go through surgery and what to expect through the eyes of a child. She's also been an educator for over 14 years, and she is passionate about inclusion in her classroom through all avenues and advocating for her students. Kasey, I am so happy you're here.
I am so happy to be here. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this.
Yeah, it's really, I've talked to a lot of people about how we have to talk about disabilities more, how even me, myself, like when we first started Kind Cotton, it was all about incorporating BIPOC books and then finding like these areas in which we were really lacking in representation, and disabilities 100% being one of them. And I've never spoken to someone about what it's like as a mom. So I'm really happy that you're here to kind of discuss your challenges, your joy, what you have learned over the past 9 years. I want to hear all about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to think of the fact that it's been 9 years already. It's, I can put myself back in that moment when we got his diagnosis versus other times where I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel like I've lived such a long life. And really it's so different from the parent side of things, and really recognizing that, yes, I am the parent of a child with a disability. There are certain challenges that as a parent I go through, just like any parent does, but really being able to recognize that difference of I am a parent, but I'm not my child, and he lives a very different life, and I'll never understand that. And so I think that's one of the biggest things is sometimes because when they're younger, so involved in their care and so involved in making all of those decisions, but making sure it doesn't get away from us,
That makes a lot of sense. I also feel like, I don't want to broadly state this, but even like being a parent of a child who does not have a disability, I know that we can kind of be helicopter parents. And in doing so, we're kind of taking away a piece of their humanity. So I feel like what you're talking about is really centering Carter. And I think that's important.
Yeah. And even at this young age, we're really pushing for him to learn how to advocate for himself. When I take him to an appointment, and there's always like the check-in process, I don't even walk up to the desk anymore. So you can do this. You can check in for yourself. Remember, at an appointment, they're going to ask you questions. This isn't about me. This is about you. So really just doing that preparation work as to what is this going to look like, because as he gets older, he may not want me in the room, and he's going to need to be able to advocate for himself, because we've learned very quickly that although we are supposed to be trusting the people in the medical field, and because they're the experts in some cases, they're not. And I am the expert on my child, and my child is definitely the expert on himself. So realizing and not being afraid to speak up and to use your voice to say, like, no, we're not going to do that, or no, this isn't the route, or actually, this is what's going on with my body. I think is just so it's important, and it's empowering to be able to teach at such a young age. So by the time they are our age, it's a part of who they are, and there's no there's no fear behind it.
That's so important. I mean, two things kind of came up to me when you said that. I recently had a doctor on, and she was a pediatrician, and I love that she stated that she talks to the child before ever speaking to the parent. She gets down on their level. She explains to them what is happening with their body because they are the patient. But I would imagine as a mom, you've probably experienced many times in which that wasn't the case. And Carter was kind of looked at as secondary, and the doctor would speak to you instead. So I love that you are teaching him to advocate for himself. I also wish that I would have done that more when I was younger. I, on a much more micro, smaller level, like suffered severely from debilitating migraines for such a long time. And I felt like every single neurologist that I ever saw, or any time I would explain that medications weren't working, or that I was having these horrific side effects from the medication that I was on, they would just up my dose and up my dose and up my dose. And I'd be like, no, like, you're not hearing me. But it got to a point where I was like, well, they're the doctor, so they must know. And I would just suffer in silence. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about. Globally, we should all hear this message, because oftentimes we're taught to be quiet and that people are the experts, and that doesn't get anyone anywhere.
Yeah. And I think too that in looking at it through the disability community, and that first piece that you were talking about, I mean, yes, a doctor will come in and just be like, how are things going, mom? And talk to me about it. But I feel like, and from the people that I have listened to and learned from and spoken to, is that happens so much in the disability community to grown adults,
Mm-hmm.
where they are passed over, and instead the doctor, social worker, whoever it might be, person on the street, starts to speak to the other adult in the room, as if that person with a disability can't speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's an important piece of making sure that we are all recognizing the person, not the person that brought them there, not the person that's standing next to them, but the actual human.
Mm. That's
So,
such an important piece of it. What is ableism?
yeah. So ableism, really, if you want to compare or think about it through racism, sexism, there's ableism, right? So really, if I'm breaking it down, it is discrimination of people with disabilities. So, and this can be seen in many different ways, just like with racism and sexism and so many, right? We know there's so many others, is we have just the open discrimination, just
Mm-hmm.
very blatant. There is microaggressions of ableism, and then we have systemically within our society. And I think, in my personal feeling and opinion, is because of that systemic ableism that has been going on for so long, that continues to go on,
Mm-hmm.
that hasn't even been truly brought to light until ADA was passed in 1990.
Yeah.
Like, I I was a young kid in 1990. And so to think of it in that way of that's how deeply rooted it has been, and it hasn't been very long.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess long story short, it's ableism is really just that discrimination of people with disabilities.
I would also argue that similar to racism, we have so many people in our world, unfortunately, who say, oh, well, like the civil rights movement happened so long ago. So, like, how could it exist anymore? Black people have the same exact rights as us, and there's no such thing as systemic racism. I would think that in the disabled community, many people would say, oh, due to ADA, there is no longer any such thing as ableism showing up, and everyone has the same rights. And, how could you claim that there is a systemic problem? What would you have to say to that?
I would say, well, if there wasn't a systemic problem, then we would have handicap accessible bathrooms on airplanes.
Mm,
There wasn't a systemic problem, then we would have Braille on all buildings. If there wasn't a systemic problem, then we would have sign language interpreters for every single television show, for every single event, for every single speech that's given. We would have people that are in positions of power that have a disability and that aren't and I say this as I know that there are people who aren't afraid to be able to be their authentic selves or to show. Um, but when I'm thinking to like President Franklin FDR was a
hmm
wheelchair user and never wanted to be seen in his chair, never wanted to have a picture taken. Like, so we can't, I would say, so what an interesting thing to say when we see when there aren't ramps to get into stores. You have to go around to like the back alley entrance. Those are all examples of ableism. So it's
hmm
definitely it's prevalent and it's around us all the time. You just have to open your eyes to be able to finally see it.
Yeah, and it's funny because something I've been telling myself once I've become much more aware of my own ableism since the pandemic is we're all only temporarily able-bodied. Like, and it is so clear what society as a whole feels about the disabled community. And that became, as did many other things, that became
Mhm.
incredibly obvious once the pandemic started.
Yeah, and I think too, this quote it's always stuck out to me is the disability community is the only minority group that any human can join at any time,
Mm,
right? And whether that is you are joining momentarily because you broke a bone, or
mhm,
you get into a car accident, or as you age, right? A lot of and so I just feel like people don't recognize that until and I'm myself am guilty of that as well. Um, we don't recognize it until you're in it in some way
mm.
or form. And that is what needs to change is being able to recognize it even though you're not a, a part of it.
What do you think the dangers of that are? What are the dangers of living in such a individualistic society?
Um, well, I think when we look at the people that are in power, um, I mean, I feel like when we look at the people who are in power, it kind of like that is enough, right? It speaks
Mhm,
volumes. Because if when we have this individualistic society, we have everyone is just focused on themselves, right? What do I need? How can I get ahead? Um, rather than that idea of community,
mhm,
rather than being able to take care of one another. And when we do that, when we are inclusive, when we bring inclusion into people's lives, whether that's in the classroom, in a friend group, in clubs and sports, whatever it might be, when we are able to do that, when we were able to make things that are truly accessible and inclusive, which those are two different things, but when we can do that, we actually make it better for everyone.
Mm.
And when that's not happening, then now we're at the point where we're segregating others.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's just the idea of how are we not, it blows my mind of like, how are we not thinking of others in this moment? How are we not considering the people who aren't at the table and they should be at the table?
Mm-hmm.
So and the fact of like just the lack of inclusion, like it doesn't even dawn on people's minds until of like, oh yeah, I would have never thought of that, or that's a good point. And it's like, well, why aren't we thinking of that in the first place? Why did that have to be brought up? And so I've thought about that a lot as especially as Carter's been getting older too, and recognizing some of the things that we see.
So how can people show up? What can people do? How can we make ourselves completely, or at least attempt to make ourselves more aware? How can we advocate? How can we include the disabled community in our advocacy efforts?
I really think the biggest piece is bringing people with disabilities into the conversation. And even if that means that in whatever platform you might be, is seeking that person out, is finding someone, is reaching out to say, hey, we want to start this new idea. We have some thoughts, but we want to get your input too, because you're part of the community. And so many times decisions are made for people with disabilities without a single person with a disability in the room to be able to say, well, wait a second, like, have you thought about this? Or I didn't hear this idea at all. So I think that's the first and easiest thing that anyone could do, is bringing and seeking people out if you don't know. I think another thing is not diminishing the stories. Is when a person with a disability tells you a lived experience, has told you how things have made them felt, is not diminishing that, is not brushing it aside or saying, oh, they didn't mean it like that, they had good intentions. None of that matters. What matters is the person that was speaking, and being able to listen to them and to learn from them. There are so many people that have made such a huge change for the disability community that we don't learn about in schools. The fact that a person, if I start talking about Judy Human, people are like, who's that? What do you mean? What do you mean? Who is that? How do you not know who Judy Human is? How do you not know who Alice Wong is, or Ed Roberts? Like, these are people that have made such a huge impact for the disability community that, and they're not in our books. Why is that? Another example of systemic ableism is it's not even seen in any of our books. And these people who have made this change aren't talked about. So I think just doing your own research and reading, and if something is shared, you click on it and you think to yourself like, oh, I've never heard of this person before. I think too, one thing, and this is maybe like further on in a person's journey or comfortability, is as a parent, and again, this is very broad, so I'm not speaking on behalf of everyone, but as a parent, and for someone that also has friends within the community, we are exhausted to always be the ones fighting for inclusion.
Mm.
We're exhausted. And it would be nice for people that say that they're allies, that they are listening, to then fight alongside with us. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if I shouldn't always have to be the one, and I'm going to use just a hypothetical. I shouldn't always be the one that has to reach out to my son's school to say, hey, can we not block the handicap parking spaces?
Mm-hmm.
Can we find another way to celebrate the 100th day of school?
That's a big one for any
Yeah,
educators listening.
yeah, like these are things that I don't mind doing it. I'm going to because I'm going to advocate for my child. But why is it that it's always fallen back on the disability community and on parents? You know, if you're really going to be an ally or a co-conspirator, then you could easily contact the school as well in that
Mm-hmm.
hypothetical situation to say, hey, I noticed the handicap spots were being blocked. Maybe next time we don't do that. You know, like, what is that? That's a 5-minute email.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being able to recognize that, again, there are people in the community that are thinking about others and not just focusing on themselves. So I hope that helps. I know it was lots of different examples, but just being able to recognize that, right? Like nothing, there's that phrase of like nothing about us without us.
Mm.
And so it's keeping that in mind.
Yeah, it's thinking again, steering away from that individualistic way of thinking into more of a community feel. And
Mhm.
what does it take to actually do that as opposed to just being performative in your actions?
Yeah. And I did wanna okay, I found this quote and oh my gosh, Caitlin, it like blew my mind last night. And I think that it just ties in really well. So it comes from Denise Scherer Jacobson. I'm gonna read it just from my paper.
Yeah,
I'm
please
like, I'm not
do.
this up. So she says, the ADA was a wonderful achievement, but the tip of the iceberg. You can pass a law, but until you can change society's attitudes, that law won't mean much.
Mm, so
And
true. And I
yeah,
feel like that goes for so many things,
so many things.
right?
Absolutely.
Like a
Yeah.
law doesn't really mean anything unless we are taking that law into account and making complete shifts,
Yeah.
right?
And being able to teach people why it's so important so that
Mhm.
then that care comes into it and makes
Mhm.
yeah, it makes that whole general shift. And that would be having to make big changes that people and especially people in power are not interested from
Mhm.
what I can see are not very interested in doing.
Yeah. So tell us about your book. I want to hear about this because I knew personally that Kasey was coming out with a book. I did not realize the details of it. I think it's amazing that you and your son are working on this together, and I want to hear what that's like. Any and all details you can share.
Sure. So I had been thinking for a while about wanting to write something. And I know that my journey and experience with Carter, that there are lots of other moms that have had fetal surgery. I know that ours is, particular with being the first in the state. Um, and so I thought like, oh, that's like such a narrow topic, and not that it's not important, but wanted to be able to create something that really would just kind of hit all scopes, and be able to help support all people. And so, um, Carter very much has a lot of anxiety when it comes to surgery. And
Mm,
it's because he's gone through so many in such a short period of time in his life, and the understanding of he knows he's going to have more. Um, and that kind of got me thinking, and, you know, is there, I started to kind of do some research like, are there any books for kids to just kind of like help ease that fear, that anxiousness? Because any surgery is a big deal, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. And I couldn't really find anything that was through the eyes of people who had experienced it. There are books that had been written by anesthesiologists and
Hmm.
by doctors, um, but nothing that really took you from learning that you're having a surgery to what happens after and
Mm.
everything in between it. Even as simple as what does the pre-op area look like? What are some of the sounds you might,
Mm.
who are the people you might meet before your surgery? Um, for a child after surgery, you might go home right away, or you might have to stay in the hospital. And being able to give them the opportunity to prepare their minds for that, while also including some, we made sure in the book to say something of, when the doctor says, "Are there any questions?" That's the time for you to ask questions too. So, really bringing in that advocacy piece of like,
Mm.
this isn't just for your family to ask questions, but you get to ask questions too because it's your surgery. That's
Mhm.
your surgeon. It's not your family's, it's yours. Um, so I'm really excited. And I think too, it was really fresh in our minds because Carter had gone through a pretty significant surgery recently. And so he helped me, and I would just kind of almost interview him and ask him questions.
Mhm.
How did this make you feel? Or what are some things here? And or what's something that you think kids should know, and being able to really put that in there. So I'm really excited. I'm very new to the book writing world. And so now we're just at a point where we're trying to put those final pieces together and hopefully find an illustrator soon who can really bring it all and tie it all
Mhm.
an inclusive way. Like I sent it to a friend to say, like, tell me what you think. Also, in parentheses, I put ideally like what I'm hoping, because I want every single child to be able to open the book and be able to point to themselves.
Mm.
That looks like me. Um, and so because I think that's so the representation. I know, you've talked about it forever since we've connected in this corner of the earth, and just being able to see yourself represented in some way, shape, or form. And so that's where we're at now.
That's so beautiful because even as an adult, surgery is incredibly anxiety inducing for many of us, right? So to be able to see it through the eyes of a child and just have it as a tool. I mean, I know we have a book that we read before we go and get our vaccines with Kenzie, and that has been almost life changing. Like she deals with them so much better. Like she knows exactly what to expect. We're
Mhm.
not lying to her and saying that it's not going to hurt. Like
Yeah.
just all of these things that I find many times we're not truthful with our children.
Mm,
It's so important. So I'm really, really, really excited about that.
thank you. I
It's
am
going to be
too.
awesome.
I think Mike got a little ahead of himself for me, and he was like, "Could you imagine what if hospitals got this? And every time a kid is born,
Mm.
they get this book of like, here's something to help." And I was like, "Well, I love that, but let's."
No, I think that I mean, yeah, that's the dream, right? That's the dream. I get that. So, Casey, before we go, I know we've talked a lot about it without exactly naming it, but I would love to know from your perspective in what we've been talking about, what does kindness mean to you?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing for me is that kindness is courageous. Um, that's always been my biggest takeaway. And I feel that way because there are so many different ways to show your courage. Um, and every single person is different. I see it as not being afraid to use your voice, whether that's to speak up for yourself or to speak up for others who maybe don't have the opportunity to do it for themselves. Which I think especially right now in everything that's going on is important to be able to use that bravery, to not be afraid, to recognize that I don't know what's going to happen when I say the things that I'm going to say, but in my heart, I believe that it's important. And if the voiceless, and I put that in air quotes because I think of ableism in that way, but
Mm-hmm.
to be able to use my voice for someone who may not have the opportunity to do so, showing up for others, calling things out when we see that something is wrong. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's mine. When I think of being kind, I think about being courageous, and how that is a big piece of I can show my kindness by being brave and by speaking up when I see injustices happening in the world.
It's so perfect. I love it. It's always, I love talking to everyone, but I'm always just so obsessed with hearing everyone's definitions. And kindness is courage is amazing. Thank you so much, Kasey, for being here.
Thank you. I so appreciate it. I always have love what you're doing. And so I'm just so grateful to be able to share my small little platform in this great big space. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Kindness Is podcast. If you love it and it's adding even a little bit of value to your life, we would love, love, love if you could subscribe, rate, and review so we can reach even more people and make this world a little bit more kind.